I think I might be the only person in history whose HOA tried to sink their yacht. Yes, sink it. Not fine it, not tow it, but actively sink it. Too bad for them, they didn't do their homework. The story starts not with a splash, but with a beige envelope. I was what the neighborhood called the quiet guy up the hill. I'm a real estate lawyer who specializes in the hyper-specific, utterly tedious world of coastal property law and maritime easements. It's the kind of job that requires you to be patient, methodical, and invisible. Three things: the new, aggressive HOA, led by its smug antagonist, President Karen, or PK, simply was not. If you've ever had a run-in with a truly ridiculous HOA, you already know the rage I felt. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I bet your story can't top this one. I had just docked my newly acquired yacht, a beautiful vessel I called the Coastal Observer. She was just under the community's strict length limit, a fact I'd verified with a precise, almost clinical attention to detail before I even signed the papers. Within 48 hours, that beige envelope showed up, slid under my door with a dramatic flourish, no doubt by one of PK's eager little lieutenants. The fine was for an alleged violation. My yacht was disrupting the aesthetic continuity of the marina. It was pure, unadulterated entitlement, packaged as a legal document. PK's condescending note, which I still have, was a classic piece of suburban warfare theater. While your vessel technically adheres to the minimum length requirements, it read, with that unmistakable arrogant tone of someone who believes they are above the written rules, the spirit of the covenant clearly dictates a smaller, more uniform presence. Docking is hereby revoked, and a fine is immediately assessed. My blood ran cold, but my mind was already calculating. They were so focused on the boat being 3 inches over some perceived aesthetic line that they'd completely missed the digital ghost of the documents. My initial, quiet thought, the one that set this entire dramatic narrative in motion, was simple and firm. They clearly haven't read the whole deed. The beige envelope was only the first shot in what quickly became suburban warfare. My immediate, professional response was not emotional, it was purely factual. I compiled a binder, the kind you use for closing a multi-million-dollar property deal, containing the precise dimensional surveys, the official marina size regulations, and the section of the covenant proving definitively that the Coastal Observer was compliant. This wasn't a conversation. It was a legal demonstration presented with quiet authority. I even highlighted the relevant sections in yellow and attached a notarized statement from the surveyor. I expected a grudging, bureaucratic retraction. What I got instead was a dismissal laced with open contempt. I was granted a 5-minute slot at the next board meeting, where PK's arrogance was on full toxic display. She didn't even glance at my meticulous binder. She tapped a scarlet nail on the mahogany table and declared, "Mr. Protagonist's name, we are not interested in your technicalities. This community operates on a standard of decency and visual harmony. The board determines what is appropriate, not a rulebook." Her flaw, the one that would prove to be her undoing, was believing her implied social status superseded documented law. When I calmly reiterated the covenant, she leaned forward and delivered the line that became the mantra of her self-destruction. Rules are for the residents, not the board. The fines began to escalate, 1,000 paper cuts designed to bleed me dry or force me to sell my yacht. Then, the escalation went from petty to overtly criminal. A second, heavier beige envelope arrived, containing a formal legal notice alleging maritime nuisance. This wasn't a fine, it was a threat. The notice stated they would hire a specialized crew to reposition the unapproved vessel via non-standard means if the fines weren't paid. You don't need to be a lawyer to know what non-standard means implies on the water. It was a thinly veiled, documented threat to unmoor and potentially sink my yacht. The absurdity of it all, the sheer entitlement, snapped something inside me. The frustration vanished, replaced by a cold, methodical anger. That moment, holding that piece of paper, I stopped seeing them as neighbors and started seeing them as a legal adversary whose tactical errors I was about to exploit. I was done talking. The time for planning had begun. My first move wasn't to argue about the length of my yacht or the definition of aesthetic continuity. That was their territory, emotional, volatile, and ultimately meaningless. As a real estate lawyer specializing in coastal property, I knew the real battlefield wasn't the water, it was the dirt underneath. So, the pacing of my personal war machine slowed way down. I didn't hire a lawyer because I am the expert in this highly specialized brand of legal minutia. I decided to focus not on the petty dock rules of the current covenant, but on the deep history of the entire marina property, going back before the current crop of entitled bullies even moved in. I spent the next week buried in the county recorder's office, feeling like a forensic accountant hunting for a hidden offshore account. I wasn't looking at the HOA bylaws, I was tracing the lineage of the original land grant. This was the methodical, tedious work that established my credibility and would become my Chekhov's gun. And then, I found it. After hours of staring at old, yellowing, microfished legal documents, the kind of paper trail nobody ever bothers to follow, a single obscure clause jumped out at me from the original master deed from the 1970 seconds. It was tucked away in a schedule of exceptions, referencing a separate legal entity for the coastal protection structure. My hand, steady and calm, circled the cryptic, beautiful clause, accepting and reserving unto the grantor all rights, title, and interest in the Breakwater and its subterranean easements. The rest of the document created the community and the marina, but this paragraph excluded the massive, stone structure that protected every single dock and every piece of waterfront property in their entire precious community. The HOA, in their arrogance, had focused only on the flashy covenants and rules, never bothering to check the foundation. They had built their kingdom on someone else's property, and they hadn't realized that the single most critical piece of infrastructure, the huge, silent breakwater that made their marina possible, didn't actually belong to them. That single 20-word clause was about to change the entire scope of the battle. Finding the clause that exempted the breakwater was the key, but a key is useless without a lock. I had to know who currently owned that exemption. The original grantor was listed as Coastal Development Holdings Incorporated, an old, defunct holding company that had liquidated its assets decades ago. This wasn't a quick title search. This was a deep dive into corporate genealogy, a meticulous, tedious process that only a professional steeped in the dry arts of finance and property law would dare attempt. It felt like hunting for a single wire in a massive, chaotic junction box. I started tracing the stock transfers, following the paper trail through 3 separate acquisitions and 2 different states, navigating forgotten legal filings and obscure bankruptcy proceedings. It was the kind of work that demanded absolute patience, contrasting sharply with the loud, emotional outbursts of PK and her board, who were still sending me increasingly ridiculous fine notices. It took 3 weeks of staring at property law that hasn't been updated since the Nixon administration. I later mused, a blend of exhaustion and quiet triumph, but I found the gap. The discovery was better than I could have hoped for. The holding company, though officially dissolved, had its last remaining residual asset, the title to the coastal protection structure, transferred to a private individual during its final winding down. The new owner was a man named Mr. Alden, a wise, older figure who had seemingly vanished off-grid, living a quiet life far from the pretentious marina. He was the reluctant ally I hadn't known I needed, the one person who held the deed to the most valuable piece of real estate in the entire community. The irony was palpable. The HOA was fighting a high-profile battle over a few feet of yacht, while the foundation of their entire world, the structure that kept the ocean out, was owned by a man who probably didn't even have an email address. I now had the information. I had the owner. All that remained was the methodical work of claiming what was rightfully mine and using it to bring down their tyranny. The plan, however, was still a quiet secret. The trail of forgotten corporate filings led me about 3 hours inland, to a remote, dusty office above a derelict boat repair workshop, a place that smelled of old oil and quiet neglect, a perfect contrast to the glossy, sun-drenched arrogance of the marina. This was where I found Mr. Alden, the holder of the golden ticket, the man who legally owned the foundation of PK's entire kingdom. He was a wise, older figure, initially skeptical and deeply cynical, having clearly seen the worst of entitled coastal developers. I didn't lead with my yacht. I led with the master deed and the specifics of his inheritance. I laid out the meticulously traced corporate genealogy on a workbench covered in tools. His eyes, sharp and clear, scanned the highlighted clause confirming my research. He legally inherited 100% ownership of the coastal protection structure. He owned the Breakwater. He confirmed it with a dry, humorless chuckle. "I just assumed it was worthless paper," he said. "Never thought it had any value, just an old family asset." The irony was stunning, the kind of subtle punchline that only property law can deliver. The entire luxury community, with its million-dollar yachts and its tyrannical HOA, had been built on the protection provided by a massive, 1,000-foot-long structure that they didn't own. They had been too entitled to read the fine print, too smug to check the foundation. They were fighting me over 3 feet of fiberglass, while the real vulnerability, the physical wall that saved their property from the sea, was in the hands of a stranger. I skipped the small talk and presented my offer. I wasn't just there to buy a piece of forgotten property. I was there to purchase an instrument of righteous justice. I offered a generous sum for the dormant holding company, making it clear that my intention wasn't profit but principle. I planned to use it, I stated calmly, to teach those bullies, the ones threatening to sink my boat, a permanent lesson in legal due diligence. Mr. Alden looked at the papers, then at my cold, determined face. He was an observer of the world, and he understood the desire for vindication. Seeing a chance for his own form of quiet revenge against the type of people who had surely burned him in the past, he offered a small smile and took the pen. The deal was done. The man who was the quiet guy up the hill now owned the Breakwater. The transaction to purchase the dormant holding company and, by extension, the Breakwater itself, was executed with the surgical precision and zero fanfare that defined my professional life. This wasn't a grand real estate closing, it was a ghost moving through the digital ether. Leveraging my legal and financial background, I filed the new corporate documents under a completely anonymous shell company, ensuring there was absolutely no trail leading back to the quiet guy up the hill who owned the slightly too large yacht. The entire process was conducted remotely, culminating in a single, clean wire transfer slip for a surprisingly small amount, a fraction of what the HOA's annual budget probably was. The true value was never in the dollar amount. It was in the legal principle it represented. To ensure the element of surprise the most critical part of my counterattack, I included stringent security measures in the sale agreement with Mr. Alden. A robust, non-disclosure, divided by non-compete clause ensured his complete silence, effectively taking him off the grid and preventing the desperate HOA from trying to buy back the Breakwater at the 11th hour. Mr. Alden was more than happy to agree. He was keenly interested in watching the arrogance of the coastal elite collapse. I was sitting in my study, reviewing the final executed documents, when the true scope of their colossal mistake hit me. It was a moment of cold, perfect calculation. They were so focused on my yacht being 3 feet too long that they never thought to check the deed for the 1,000-foot wall that made their entire community possible. They had spent weeks threatening me with fines and legal action over something trivial and subjective, while ignoring the bedrock of their entire existence. Arrogance, I realized, is not just a personality flaw. It is a terrible strategic blind spot. They were so busy looking out that they forgot to check what was under their feet. The quiet guy up the hill was about to become the property owner who held their community hostage, legally and absolutely. The moment of reckoning was finally upon us, initiated not by me, but by their continued arrogance. The HOA, confident in the impunity of their power and thoroughly ignorant of the digital ghost that now owned their foundation, upped the ante. A third beige envelope arrived, heavier and more threatening than the others. This one wasn't just a fine, it was a final warning. They had hired a marine salvage company, a glorified term for a tow crew with heavy ropes to forcibly reposition the coastal observer within 48 hours. They were ready to carry out their thinly veiled threat to unmoor and potentially destroy my property. I didn't bother responding to the threat. That would have been engaging in the petty skirmish they wanted. Instead, I initiated the first clean blow of the real war. Using a completely separate legal firm and the crisp, newly designed letterhead of my quietly reactivated holding company, the legal owner of the Breakwater, I drafted a certified, formal letter to the entire HOA board and their external counsel. My tone was calm, factual, and terrifyingly terse. The content was devoid of emotion, a masterpiece of dry legal authority. It simply stated that as the sole legal owner of the coastal protection structure, the Breakwater and all associated pilings and easements, I was giving them a 24-hour notice to remove their unapproved docks that were currently and illegally trespassing on my private property. I flipped the entire narrative on its head. I wasn't the violator, they were the trespassers. They had spent weeks trying to kick me out of a 2-foot space they thought they owned. I was now demanding they vacate 1,000 feet of dock they definitely didn't. The letter concluded with the cold professional line that I knew would send a shockwave through their mahogany boardroom. Failure to comply will result in the immediate commencement of legal remediation procedures, including, but not limited to, the demolition and removal of all infringing structures. The quiet guy up the hill was done playing neighborly. The countdown to their complete legal collapse had begun. The preemptive strike landed like a depth charge, not making a loud noise on the surface, but causing absolute chaos underneath. The HOA board's initial reaction to my cease and desist letter, the one demanding they remove their docks for trespassing on my property, was predictable. A blend of furious disbelief and raging entitlement. PK was convinced it's a frivolous lawsuit, a desperate bluff, cooked up by the quiet guy up the hill, whose yacht she'd been trying to sink. She immediately instructed their high-priced corporate lawyer to send back a threatening, dismissive reply, demanding my shell company retract its claim or face sanctions. I didn't dignify their emotional bluster with an argument. I simply hit reply and sent a single, devastating attachment. It wasn't a threat, a demand, or an explanation. It was the unassailable evidence, a certified recorded copy of the deed of ownership for the Breakwater, stamped with the unmistakable county recorder's seal, along with the original 1,970 seconds legal description. I was giving them the precise technical coordinates of their self-inflicted legal oblivion. What followed was a beautiful display of dawning horror, the kind you can only truly appreciate when you're watching smug certainty dissolve into panic. The visual cue, I imagine, would have been a frantic montage of their video calls, faces slowly transitioning from tight-lipped aggression to wide-eyed, slack-jawed terror as they realized the extent of their folly. Their lawyer, a man who had undoubtedly built a career on bullying people with fine print, was the one who had to deliver the fatal diagnosis. The narrative reached its perfect moment of dry, subtle irony when, according to a reliably gossipy source on the inside, the lawyer told the board with utter resignation and a touch of professional awe, "I've never seen anything this airtight. You literally don't own the seawall." They had wasted their energy attacking a 3-foot technicality while I had quietly acquired the foundation of their entire pretentious existence. The war had just begun, but the victory was already in the deed. The HOA board's reaction to the confirmed deed, the undeniable truth that the foundation of their community belonged to the guy with the unapproved yacht, was immediate and chaotic. They called an emergency, closed-door meeting, a frantic, highly charged session that devolved into a desperate discussion of ill-conceived plans. filing a quitclaim lawsuit based on adverse possession, launching a public smear campaign against me, the supposedly harmless quiet guy up the hill, or, in a flash of lucidity quickly dismissed, actually trying to buy the Breakwater back. They were drowning in emotional outbursts, fueled by entitlement and sheer panic. But their chaos was my choreography. I had long anticipated their frantic scramble for a solution. While they were busy screaming into their phones and formulating irrational demands, I was already implementing the next phase of my quiet, methodical plan. I used my holding company to file a preemptive injunction in the county court. This carefully tailored legal maneuver prevented the HOA from doing two critical things: issuing any new liens or fines against any resident, and, most importantly, changing their corporate charter or bylaws without my company's express written approval. I wasn't just using coastal property law as a shield, I was using it as a surgical weapon. This single injunction effectively neutered their entire organization, leaving them powerless to collect funds, retaliate against me, or even change the rules to suit their collapsing position. The contrast was stark. Their side was all volume and fury, fueled by the delusion of their own power. My side was silence and paperwork, driven by cold, technical fact. While they were screaming into their phones, I thought, with a sense of calm, absolute control, I was filing the paperwork that would neuter their entire organization. Their time for talking was over. Now, their time for compliance or total collapse had begun. With the HOA's hands legally tied by the preemptive injunction, they were completely incapacitated, unable to issue a single new fine or even properly organize a defense. They had expected a slugfest. I delivered a quiet, legal chokehold. It was time to introduce the terms of their surrender. Through a separate, anonymous legal firm, maintaining the persona of the indifferent, technical owner of the Breakwater, I sent a new letter to the board. It wasn't a demand for the multi-million-dollar value of the coastal structure that would have let them think they could buy their way out. Instead, it was an offer to lease the Breakwater property back to them for an almost offensively trivial sum, $1 per year. The price was ridiculously low, a perfect distillation of the dry, subtle irony that fueled my strategy, highlighting the fact that the protagonist doesn't want money, he wants justice and control. The value of that Breakwater was in the principal, not the rent. However, this charitable, nearly free lease was contingent upon two non-negotiable terms, two items I knew would shatter the board's collective ego. The first term was non-monetary but absolute, a full, public, and written apology to me, the quiet guy, up the hill, specifically and unequivocally addressing the heinous threat to hire a crew to reposition the Coastal Observer via non-standard, means the thinly veiled threat to sink my yacht. They had to own their specific malice. The second term was the final devastating blow to their reign of entitlement. The immediate written resignation of PK and the entire current board of directors. They had to step down, publicly and permanently, giving up every last shred of the power they had abused. Their tyranny was now faced with a choice: accept the most humiliating public surrender, or watch the legal foundation of their community be utterly withdrawn. The clock was ticking on their pride. My methodical assault was purely legal, but I knew that public opinion, when properly deployed, could be as devastating as an injunction. To accelerate the internal breakdown of the HOA and ensure their humiliation was complete, I quietly orchestrated a media leak. I didn't go to the major news channels. I contacted a highly respected local maritime news blog, a niche publication whose readership was composed of exactly the kind of boat owners and property investors who would appreciate the exquisite irony of the situation. I provided them with copies of the initial sinking threat and, more importantly, the certified deed proving I now owned the Breakwater. The effect was instantaneous and toxic to the board's authority. The narrative immediately shifted from the HOA being a powerful governing body upholding standards to them being a group of petty, entitled bullies who were so blinded by their own arrogance they had risked the entire community's infrastructure over a few feet of yacht. The story, framed as HOA tries to sink man's yacht, finds out he owns their seawall, went viral within the coastal community. Public opinion wasn't just turning, it was openly cheering for the quiet guy up the hill. Neighbors, who had been silently oppressed by PK's reign of arbitrary fines and self-serving rules, started showing their support, offering quiet nods and secret emails of encouragement. They finally realized the scale of the board's idiocy. The tension ramped up dramatically as the final 24-hour deadline for accepting my humiliating lease offer approached. The visual cue of their crumbling world was perfect. I saw PK standing near the community mailbox, frantically talking on her cell phone, likely dealing with the fallout of the article or the demands of the new. Panicked board members, while conspicuously ignoring several angry neighbors who were finally finding their voices. She was still in full bluster mode. But the smug certainty was gone, replaced by a desperate, cornered look. She was trapped, legally and publicly, in the exact prison of rules she had tried to impose on me. The final, humiliating deadline for the lease offer arrived, and predictably, the answer from President Karen was a resounding, fiery no. PK, fueled by an intoxicating mix of pure arrogance and outright denial, refused to accept the terms of the surrender. She fired back a final, dismissive letter written in screaming all caps, delivered not in a beige envelope but via a frantic email blast. She called the lease offer extortion, an abuse of power, and petty revenge engineered by the quiet guy up the hill who was clearly just jealous of her leadership. She was so blinded by her self-importance that she couldn't comprehend that I was simply utilizing the law she had relied on for so long. But her stubborn bluster provided the opening for the next decisive phase. In her haste to reassure the panicked residents who were now reading the viral maritime blog post and realizing their homes were protected by a structure the HOA didn't own, PK made a fatal public mistake. She issued a community-wide statement claiming the board has secured a separate external engineering firm to immediately inspect and certify the breakwater for structural integrity. It was a perfectly self-inflicted legal wound. By announcing the need to hire an external firm to inspect and certify the breakwater, she was inadvertently, publicly, and legally admitting two things. 1. That the board had not been maintaining the structure that protected their community, and 2. That they explicitly had no jurisdiction or ownership over the structure. You don't hire an outside firm to inspect a piece of property you fully own and control unless you are trying to cover up a liability, and by doing so, she had established a clear paper trail confirming my company's claim. I read the community email while sipping coffee on the Coastal Observer, a small, triumphant smile playing on my lips. It was the final desperate move of a defeated general. She had tried to sink my boat, she had tried to ruin my reputation, and now she had just signed the death warrant on her own reign. The time for talking, negotiating, or posturing was definitively over. The time for legal remediation, as outlined in my initial letter, had arrived. The deadline I had given them, the final, humiliating opportunity to accept the lease and bow out gracefully, expired at 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. The clock striking 0 signaled the immediate commencement of legal remediation. This wasn't going to be a big, dramatic show. It was going to be a targeted, surgical strike, demonstrating absolute power with minimal fuss. I wanted to establish the chilling, undeniable reality of my ownership. Within the hour, a small crew of engineers and surveyors, hired by my holding company and carrying official city permits, arrived at the marina entrance. They bypassed the pathetic little security arm, another structure that, ironically, sat partially on the breakwater's forgotten easement. Their target was not the docks, not yet. It was something small, non-essential, and purely ornamental. The enormous, pretentious HOA entrance sign, a massive stone monolith carved with the community's overly formal name, which stood squarely on the legal edge of my coastal protection structure property line. I watched from my deck as the crew, calm and professional, began their work. They didn't use a wrecking ball. They used specialized tools to methodically and legally disassemble the monument. The site was the perfect visual cue of their crumbling authority. The surveyors' bright vests contrasting with the manicured lawns, the sound of concrete drills where there should have been only silence. The irony was exquisite. The HOA, which demanded the coastal observer be removed, now watches, impotent, as their own property is legally disassembled. They couldn't issue a fine, they couldn't call the police, they couldn't even trespass on their own breakwater to interfere. All because I owned the land under the sign. They had demanded I read their covenant, and in response, I had read the foundation of their entire world. The message was clear, terrifyingly so. What they thought was theirs was now mine to take apart. The demolition of the decorative entrance sign was too much for President Karen's fragile ego to bear. Her sense of entitlement, that intoxicating mix of belief that she was untouchable and the law was beneath her, finally boiled over. She raced down the hill, a magnificent display of indignant rage, her face contorted in fury. Ignoring the calm, permit-holding crew, she launched herself into the site, screaming that they were trespassing and that the land is HOA property. She physically tried to stop the engineering team from packing up the disassembled chunks of concrete. This was the climax I had been waiting for, the emotional outburst that proved the HOA's lack of control. I wasn't going to engage with her on the ground. I was watching the whole pathetic spectacle unfold from the serene comfort of the coastal observer, calmly bobbing in the water she had tried to kick me out of. I simply picked up my cell phone and called the local police non-emergency number, not as the angry resident, but as the meticulous, authoritative owner. My statement was simple, calm, and factual. An unauthorized civilian is currently interfering with a legally permitted private construction operation on my private property, the coastal protection easement. She is refusing to desist. The irony that followed was a moment of pure cinematic justice. PK, the self-proclaimed ruler of the community, was met by two local patrol officers. Still shouting about aesthetic continuity and unapproved vessels, she tried to pull rank, insisting the crew were the real criminals. The police, of course, are professionals who understand the difference between an emotional outburst and a recorded deed. I strolled down to the scene, holding only the laminated official copy of the deed. My only dialogue was the calm statement I gave the officer, which contrasted sharply with PK's sputtering rage. I simply showed the officer my deed and pointed to the map showing the easement boundary. The civilian is standing directly on my parcel, interfering with my legal right to remediation. The look on her face when the officer, realizing the legal severity of the situation, detained her for trespassing on the property she thought she controlled was priceless. The cuffs clicked quietly, professionally, and the tyranny of President Karen was, in that moment, entirely neutralized. With PK facing a potential misdemeanor charge for trespassing on property she thought she controlled, the remaining HOA board was in utter disarray, a panicked, headless organism. This was the precise moment to escalate from symbolic demolition to existential threat. I wasn't interested in slow, agonizing attrition anymore. I was going for the kill shot. Using my holding company's legal counsel, I issued the formal, final notice. This document targeted the heart of their entire community, the main marina docks themselves. The letter was technical and undeniable, stating that the docks were structurally integrated into the breakwater's pilings and constitute a clear, continuing trespass on my property. They had no legal right to anchor anything to the structure I owned. The ultimatum was ice-cold and immediate. The HOA had exactly 72 hours to legally come to terms before I, as the property owner, would commence the full decommissioning of all utilities. I had traced the subterranean easement, the forgotten space underneath the breakwater, and confirmed that the power, water, and sewage lines serving the entire waterfront community ran directly through my private parcel. No agreement meant no power for the docks, no water for the yachts, and, most damningly, no sewage for the dockside restrooms and some nearby homes. To ensure they fully understood the gravity of their situation, I coupled the utility threat with a crushing financial demand. My expertise as a real estate lawyer allowed me to calculate and invoice the HOA for 50 years of retroactive easement usage fees plus compound interest. The number was crippling, a multi-million-dollar figure that far exceeded the HOA's entire reserve fund and would instantly bankrupt their operation. I signed the documents, knowing I had just delivered a fatal blow. As I explained my strategy to my lawyer, I didn't want the money, but I wanted the leverage that would completely bankrupt their operation. The only way out was unconditional surrender. The final, devastating notice, the threat to decommission utilities, and the multi-million-dollar invoice for 50 years of retroactive easement usage fees didn't just hit the remaining HOA board. It struck the entire community like a seismic event. The news of the pending utility shutoff, which would instantly transform their luxury waterfront properties into unserviceable liabilities, caused a full-scale panic. This was no longer about a slightly too long yacht. This was about financial ruin and the immediate collapse of their way of life. The board, which had spent its reign acting as an entitled bully, was now completely isolated. Residents weren't just angry, they were terrified. They realized that PK's personal vendetta and the board's collective arrogance had gambled and lost the foundation of their community. The air was thick with the scent of betrayal, and the whispers of a massive class action lawsuit against the now powerless board members began to circulate immediately. In a satisfying twist of the underdog story theme, I began to receive a flood of support. Emails, anonymous calls, and even carefully folded notes slipped under my door confirmed that I had an entire community secretly rooting for my righteous revenge. These were people who had suffered their own quiet, petty tyrannies under PK's reign, ridiculous fines for lawn height, arbitrary demands for paint colors, and the constant threat of censure. But I remained unmoved and firm in my demands. There was no room for mercy or negotiation now. The price of their arrogance had been set, and it required a complete regime change. My stance was deliberate and cold. This had transcended personal vengeance. I wasn't doing this just for myself, I thought, watching the frantic activity on the docks below. I was doing it for every person who had ever been bullied by an arrogant HOA, for every person who had been told their voice didn't matter because some petty tyrant owned the rulebook. Justice required full, undeniable compliance. The chaos they had unleashed was now eating them alive, and I was the quiet steward of that justice. The 72-hour ultimatum, the pending utility shutoff, and the crushing multi-million-dollar invoice finally broke the spirit of the remaining board members. It was a purely legal victory, secured by the fine print and driven home by the threat of immediate, catastrophic financial liability. The HOA's lawyer, realizing that a court battle over the original 1,970 seconds deed was unwinnable, forced a full, unconditional capitulation. The lawyer knew a loss meant professional embarrassment. For the board, it meant personal bankruptcy. Simultaneously, the residents, terrified of losing their utilities and facing the massive debt, took decisive action. They swiftly convened an emergency meeting and installed a new interim board, one whose sole, immediate purpose was to sign whatever documents I required. The climax of the entire saga was not a dramatic courtroom scene, but a quiet exchange of paper. I finally received the formal, signed agreement, the document that confirmed my ultimate triumph. It contained everything I had meticulously planned for. First, the entire board, including PK, was permanently removed and banned from any future HOA leadership role. Their reign of entitlement was over, forever. Second, a written, public apology, specifically mentioning the malicious sinking threat, was to be immediately published in the community newsletter. My vindication had to be public and undeniable. And third, The Coastal Observer, my yacht that had started this entire absurd conflict, was granted a permanent, non-revocable, covenant-exempt docking spot in perpetuity. The boat was officially untouchable. The true, deep irony was that I agreed to drop the multi-million-dollar retroactive invoice. My legal company retained ownership of the Breakwater, maintaining the absolute control, but I relinquished the cash demand. This confirmed the entire essence of the conflict. Justice wasn't about the money. It was about the quiet authority. I didn't want their reserves. I just wanted them to acknowledge the price of their arrogance. They learned, at the cost of their dignity and power, that the quiet guy up the hill was the one who actually owned the foundation. The official, signed settlement document was my vindication. But the real, deeply satisfying payoff came 2 weeks later. The narrative of PK's defeat needed a visual conclusion, a final, public moment to seal the end of her reign of arrogance. I got it on a dreary Tuesday afternoon. I was on the Coastal Observer, enjoying the newly covenant-exempt status of my permanent slip, when a massive moving van pulled up to PK's opulent waterfront mansion. She had resigned, of course, as per the agreement, and the stress of the legal collapse, the financial liability, and the community's swift abandonment had evidently proved too much. She was leaving. I settled back into the cockpit cushions, perfectly relaxed, watching the silent, desperate scramble of her employees loading up the visible trophies of her self-importance. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated the calm protagonist versus the emotional antagonist. I was peace, and she was frantic upheaval. The visual cue was almost too perfect, a piece of cinematic staging that felt utterly deserved. I imagined a close-up shot of me, utterly still, watching as the moving van slowly pulled away from the curb. In the distance, reflecting briefly on a window of her empty mansion, a memory. The flashing red and blue lights painting stripes from the day she was arrested for trespassing on my easement. It was a potent image of her downfall. She never once looked down toward the docks, and she certainly never looked up the hill toward my modest home. That was her flaw, her great, tragic mistake. She never thought to look past the surface. She only saw the boat, the fine, the insignificant details. She never saw the legal foundation. My final internal thought about her, the quiet summation of the entire conflict, was one of cold, professional finality. She never even looked up the hill. She never thought the quiet guy knew how to read the finer print. Arrogance is expensive, and now she was paying the bill. The departure of PK and her entitled entourage left a power vacuum, quickly filled by a new emergency board. These were sensible residents who were, above all, terrified. Terrified of the legal ruin they had narrowly averted, and specifically, terrified of the quiet guy up the hill who now held the deed to their shoreline protection. Their first, desperate act of governance was to attempt to placate the new legal reality. They immediately and unanimously voted to grant me an advisory, non-voting position on the board by default, a transparent offering meant to ensure they would never, ever cross me again. It was a generous, if slightly pathetic gesture, but I calmly, professionally declined. I wasn't interested in the trappings of their petty suburban authority. I had already secured the only things that truly mattered. I simply retained my hard-won concessions, my permanent, covenant-exempt docking spot for the Coastal Observer, and the absolute, unassailable ownership of the Breakwater. The holding company that owned the seawall remained dormant, a digital ghost in the corporate records, quietly waiting. It was the ultimate leverage power I held but didn't need to wield. This was the core lesson of the entire engagement. The ultimate victory wasn't about seizing control of the HOA or demanding millions. It was about establishing an undisputed, unchallengeable authority. The narrative finally offered its clean, satisfying reflection on the triumph. The best kind of power is the power you don't have to use. The board was now a responsible, efficient body, not out of inherent goodness, but out of sheer, healthy fear of the legal landmine they knew lay under the water. The lesson they learned was permanent, and universal. Don't threaten to sink a lawyer's boat when he owns the foundation of your entire community. I was now just the quiet guy up the hill again, but one whose mere existence guaranteed peace. The sun was high, the water calm, and the noise of the community was, for the first time in months, genuinely peaceful. The war was over, decided not by shouting matches or lawsuits, but by the quiet authority of property law. I was truly the quiet guy up the hill again, but with one permanent, foundational difference. I was the quiet guy who was never, under any circumstances, to be messed with. The climax of the story deserved a clean, triumphant curtain call. I motored the Coastal Observer out of her newly designated, permanent, covenant-exempt slip. The docks, now structurally stabilized and legally compliant under the new compliant board, were silent and orderly. There was no more nervous whispering, just the sound of the rigging clicking gently in the breeze. I didn't wave to the new board members. There was no need for that kind of petty interaction, but I knew they were watching, acutely aware of the silent, powerful force gliding past their marina. My yacht cut through the water, gliding toward the open sea, and as I looked back, the final, potent visual metaphor crystallized. I passed the massive, 1,000-foot-long breakwater, the imposing stone wall that stood as the silent, unmoving symbol of my absolute control. It was my legal fortress, the very foundation of the community that had tried to sink my boat. It was a tangible reminder that every single amenity, every slip, and every waterfront home existed entirely at my technical, legal discretion. The emotional tone of that moment was pure, deeply satisfying vindication. The sea was quiet, my boat was safe, untouchable. And the HOA was finally, permanently, and rightly terrified of the man who literally held the foundation of their entire community in his wallet. The arrogance had been purged, replaced by a lasting and justifiable respect for the meticulous power of the law.